All right, greetings. Yeah, what I want to talk about right now is something I'm just noticing in society. Something I picked up on about 20 years ago or so, even way back into the 90s. That's something I noticed, but it doesn't really condense, until a certain point. Kind of like materia, of the energies around, you recognize something, but condenses into something solid. That society has always been a Ponzi scheme to some degree. And this whole massive concern that so many people have with, the birth rate and children and culture, I think it's a farce. I really do. And they're like, well, what do you mean? I'll explain. This is Freedom Phil, like, subscribe, let's get into it. I'll always turn up the video speed. And why do I say that? Because frankly, just being real about it, you should be watching videos at higher speeds. That's what I do. Let's get into it. Yeah, it's kind of refreshing hearing the system complain like bleeding goats going to the slaughter, and they're like, oh, that's kind of visual. No. I mean, these are the same people that for years constantly tell these young boys, oh, you're the problem, you're this, toxic masculinity, all this nonsense, right? And guys have heard the message, whether it was my people basically, being sacrificed once upon a time. And now the message that we were talking about years ago is mainstream. In one way or another, I look back as a prototype of my people. And I look at it now and it's like, yeah, they just know it. 1 second. What do I mean by all that? There's no confusion anymore. And a lot of the minimalism that I've talked about off and on over the years, it's now becoming second nature. I mean, in fact, I would argue it's a man's natural nature to be a minimalist if he's not trying to impress some chick. And let's be honest, the way the dating apps have gone for a lot of these young men, yeah, they realize that it's just a waste of their time. So they look for new ways and fun ways to enjoy their life. They have their hobbies, they have their pastimes, their passions. And if that involves women, cool. If it doesn't, well, it's just what it is. And so it's kind of funny when society then realizes, well, it turns out that society needs you as a young man to run on, full steam. Like they have the boiler running so powerfully that they're like, Captain, the engine can't take it. It's like Scotty screaming from the engine bay. But that's the reality of it. That's how much they need you to keep on producing. I think some of the things that you saw back in the day with the herbivore movement, where these guys were like looking at their dads and they're like, yeah, my dad literally worked himself into an early grave. And guys took note of that. Worldwide guys have taken note of that. And then the answer is, for what? I mean, how ironic is it, just kind of a side note, that if you look at gaming, for example, gaming is a very pure example of how in the West, they're trying to use everything as some sort of propaganda. And one might wonder, I've said it before, I think the socialists, they won ideologically in a lot of different spaces. And they basically strategically structured them to where you either toe their line or you just don't have a job. So they just, they ruin you. So you just have to, just like with religious people, you have to sit there and regurgitate all the same garbage. I don't care what religion you're in order to be acceptable, get a decent job, be part of the good people in your local communities, especially if you're from a small town. And if you deviate any which way, oh, people have an issue with that. Well, in that same way, they did this to the gaming community. They did it to movies. They did it to art. They did it to everything. And then they wonder why, and I'm not the first to say this. Raging Golden Eagle said this. He said, when we're still pissed off, there's still hope. But that's gone. A lot of these guys, they're done being pissed off, and they're actually becoming innovators, and they're building their own things now. And with the advancements in, say, AI art, yeah, people are going to be able to make their own dreams. I know a lot of people are scared right now, but the idea that you have a thought, a dream, and you could craft it into reality, a certain art style, that's kind of a beautiful thing. But the fact that you got to now, some of the best games are coming out of China. And why is it that China, and by the way, China for a while there had an issue. They said, well, we don't want people playing video games all the time. But now they're the top producer. Isn't that crazy? Same thing with a lot of other Asian countries. They're like, no, you need to be productive, you need to be manly, and blah, blah, blah. But they're actually producing the games people want. And that really gets down to part of the reason, not the gaming itself, but part of the reason that things have rotted so much in the West. You spent decades telling young men, you're unneeded, you're unwanted, we can do everything with heels on. And okay, guys are like, okay, we heard the message. And we also, you see the guys where basically it's pretty friggin' obvious that, look, women are perfect. Women will lie about it and say differently, but a lot of women, if they're part of a harem for this upper 2%, 5% of men, and then somewhere maybe they'll settle for one of the upper 20% men. That leaves how many different regular guys just kicked out into the cold. Now, when you know that that's your game from a very young age, that's where you're at, and really it's just like, how much of this humiliation ritual do you actually want to deal with? And one day you're just like, and here's the thing, hey, they tried to shit on me way back in the day in my 20s, where it's like, well, you're going to die alone. I don't remember if it was Hunter S. Thompson that said it, who said it, but everyone's death is a solo thing. Everyone's death. So inevitably, we pretty much all die alone anyways. Not to mention, would you really want to be slowing down and burdening your family if you truly cared about them? I'm not advising you to do anything. What I'm saying is that we all face that emptiness at some point of our lives. Well, you've pushed the magical phase. Okay, let me explain. What used to be that whole male-female interaction, that whole magic phase of youth, is now it's like the dwindling supply of mana. And now it's just further and further away to the point where the age of man, of machines, the magic is dying, the gods are dead, and the age of machines and logic is starting to come in. And so that whole airy-fairy bullshit that pretty much was being killed off in my generation. Yeah, there's a lot of young men out there, they're just running on impulse mode. And I do find it hilarious when it comes to a lot of these corporations, these cities, these societies. They're so worried about GDP. They're so worried about taxpayers. But the mask is off. You don't give a shit about those young men. Any more than people would, they'll wrap up you being shipped off to some other country traditionally throughout the course of ages as patriotism. You dying because some politician or monarch farted wrong. And now it's like you basically took away all the normal things a guy would fight for. And so we're not going out, cars, clothes. I mean, some guys are still going to get some of that shit. But for the most part, when all the guys check out, and it turns out like 75% of the jobs that are being done that are essential, the real essential jobs, are done by guys, and guys have no motivation to be those men. Society now takes notice. But it's the fact that, like I said, the mask has fallen off. They never cared about the guy. They never cared about his plight. They just cared that you were still a producer. Just kept moving. And the hope was, I guess, from a lot of the boomers and otherwise, is that they'd drop dead before this came to be. They'd spend every last bit of their money, even a lot of the Gen Xers too. They'd play the casino, win and lose with your money. And when they win, they'd piss it away like it was theirs. And then they'd drop dead. And they're like, life well lived. I pissed away all the future and all the shit. And now I go off the mortal coil, leaving debt behind, the boomer way. But society itself is now noticing that, like, without that constant supply of fuel, new workers, and then these workers basically effectively being treated like, for this power plant of society, like coal. without that fresh supply of willing workers to go out there and throw their lives into the machine, this machine doesn't function. And I'm just enjoying the decline. You know, a part of the reason I always preach minimalism, saving money, retiring younger, and part of it is like, God, the fucking head job they did on a lot of you. The idea that you think you got to work until you're 65 to retire, or if you do it by 50, man, you're successful. Try 30. The fact that most of you think the way that you were taught to think and never bothered to sit down and do any basic math or logic, I think that's also coming to an end too. See, I think men are becoming more rational. As the magic fades from society, they have no choice but to be rational. And they always had to be rational. No one's coming to save them. But now there isn't even the illusion of anybody giving a damn. And that fact that that's all faded away, the scales have come off the eyes of the average man, and society's like, where the fuck are our workers? I'm not praying for a collapse. I'm not. By no means. But I'm going to enjoy watching it if it happens. Peace.